Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's live broadcast, Management of Research Colony of Woodchucks. I'm Robert Castellanos of Labroots, and I'll be your moderator for today's event. We are delighted to bring you this educational web seminar presented by Labroots. Labroots is a leading scientific social networking website and producer of educational virtual events and webinars, contributing to the advancement of science through the content sharing capabilities. Labroots is a powerful advocate in amplifying global networks and communities. We have a few important announcements before we begin. This webcast is designed to be interactive, and we encourage you to ask questions during the event. You can submit questions by typing them in the Q&A box, which can be found by clicking on the green Q&A button at the lower left of the presentation window. You can enlarge the slide window by clicking on the screen icon in the lower right-hand corner of the slide window. If you have any technical problems hearing this presentation, please click on the support button at the top right of the presentation window or submit your problem through the green Q&A button lower left. I would like to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Margaret, or rather her preferred name, Peg Batchelder. Dr. Batchelder achieved her veterinary degree in 1987 and board certification in laboratory animal medicine in 1997. Her veterinary experience has included private pet practice, academic research, and pharmaceutical research. She has contributed both a laboratory and animal veterinarian as a researcher. Currently, she works for both Bristol-Myers as a principal veterinary scientist. Her role includes on the Animal Care and Use Committee as attending veterinarian, providing clinical care for research animals, collaborating with researchers, developing surgical animal models, and overseeing the Animal Health Assurance Program. I'll now turn it over to the doctor for her presentation.
Can you hear me now? Can you hear me?
Yes, doctor, and we'll continue with your presentation.
Okay. All right. I apologize for that technical difficulty, and I hope it doesn't happen again. It just shut off on me. So I wanted to thank everyone who's listening for coming to learn about woodchucks. They are one of my favorite species, and I don't know your background. Some of you may have had woodchucks in the past. Some of you may think you might be working with them in the future, or you might just be curious about how we handle this kind of unusual species in the lab. No matter where you're coming from, I hope you will get something out of this presentation, maybe even just a smile. So for those who are not familiar with the woodchuck, woodchuck is Marmota monax. They have quite a wide range in North America through mostly the eastern United States and up into Canada. They have a number of different names. They've been called woodchucks, groundhogs, whistlepigs, or land beavers. They are not beavers, but they kind of look like beavers if you don't look at the tail. The Native American word was Woodchuck or Woodchuck, which sounds like where woodchuck came from. They are rodents, and as other rodents, they do have long, continuously growing incisors. They have a short, stocky body, short legs, and about a half a tail. Their forelegs are very strong. Their shoulders are strong. They have large claws, and this is because they dig tunnels. They dig very complex tunnel systems with multiple chambers. They have a sleeping area, a nursery, a toilet area, and a chamber just to turn around, so if they go in forwards, they can get back out forwards. And they also have multiple entrances and exits, so they can get away if somebody's chasing them or get to a hole quickly if somebody's chasing them outside. Their weight is around 2 to 6 kilograms, or up to about 15 pounds. And that depends partly on sex and partly on season. They are a hibernating species and can lose quite a bit of their body weight during the hibernation season. During the summer, you see them in the dawn and dusk, commonly seen by the side of the road. This is called a crepuscular cycle, and that's when they're the most active. They like to eat grass, greens, fruits, vegetables. They are very appreciative of people who plant gardens and put so much lovely food in such a nice compact space. So they're not really very popular with gardeners around here. They're considered a pest and are often hunted for sport or just to get them away from the garden. In addition, their digging can damage foundations and leave holes in the ground, which can be dangerous for horses to step in and other problems. So they're not very well liked in this area. The reason that they have become a lab animal is that in 1977 it was discovered that they can carry a virus called Woodchuck Hepatitis Virus. It was discovered in 1977, and they started doing research in 1978. This is a hepadnavirus. It is very similar to human hepatitis B virus, and that's what makes it so important. It is a hepadnavirus. It has a very high homology with HBV at the nucleotide level. It has a very similar epidemiology that can cause a number of different diseases, both woodchucks and people. It can be totally asymptomatic. It can have an acute hepatitis. They can clear the virus, or they can go into a chronic hepatitis state. The acute hepatitis, they develop a very effective immune response and can clear the virus completely. The chronic state, they do have an immune response, but it is inadequate, so they end up with a chronic active hepatitis and cirrhosis of the liver. In the epidemiology, an adult animal or person infected with this type of virus is more likely to have a shorter course to build a good immune response and actually resolve the hepatitis, whereas those who are infected at a younger age, particularly neonates, have a higher chance of developing the chronic hepatitis. Besides the chronic hepatitis, a major concern is that prolonged chronic hepatitis can lead to the cirrhosis of the liver, liver failure, but also to hepatocellular carcinoma. And these pictures here on the left is a human hepatocellular carcinoma, and on the right is a woodchuck liver with multiple areas of hepatocellular carcinoma. So very similar type of progression of disease. In the human, the presence of chronic hepatitis from hepatitis B gives them approximately 100% multiple risk of developing this type of cancer. And it's the most important risk factor for people who get hepatocellular carcinoma. In woodchucks, it's thought to be a 100% incidence of tumors if they have the chronic state. Now, you might think this would kill off the woodchuck population, but interestingly, it takes so long for them to develop the cancer in terms of their natural life cycle in the wild. They just don't live long enough to be really affected in numbers by the cancer. They usually die from something else first. So all in all, they're a very valuable research model. It's very translatable to humans for viral hepatitis and for the oncogenesis that goes with it. You can study the progression of disease. They're looking at treatments to prevent or even to reverse the chronic infection. And that's why we get woodchucks in the lab, and that's why we're going to be looking at how to take care of them, because they are such a unique model. And they're also very cute. When we got woodchucks in initially, we did some research. The best housing we could come up with at the time was rabbit caging. We had a bunch of used rabbit caging. We had to modify it a bit because we knew that woodchucks are good chewers. These cages were the type that come with the plastic floors, which are supposed to be more comfortable for the rabbits, but they would have been destroyed by the woodchucks. They also had plastic feeders, and we had to have metal feeders made for them. because they would chew on those too. So everything had to be stainless steel. We did keep them on wood shavings as a bedding. It's absorbent. It gives them something to play with. It helps to pad their feet from the metal surface below. In some cases, the woodchucks are very kind of toilet trained. They'll push the litter over to the bedding over to one side and kind of use that as a litter box. They also use it as nesting material. They'll pull it into their boxes, which I'll show you in a sec, and use it to kind of make a little nest. And they do urinate a lot, and they have very soft stools, so you'd have to clean up after them every day. The volume that you get depends on the season. They do drop some in the winter season, but they do need to be cleaned daily, and then we did a full change out once or twice a week where we completely took all the bedding out and replaced it. Inside the cages, we had what we called mailboxes. These are shelters that are approximately the size of a woodchuck tunnel. The woodchucks really love these. They like to just sit in them, and they look out on the world from the doorway. Most of the time, if you walk in the room, you're going to find most of the woodchucks inside the mailboxes. So it was something that they liked. It's something that made it easier to clean the cages because you could actually slide a flat steel plate in these grooves here. There's a groove here and here on the side, so you can just slide a flat steel plate right down in there, lock them in the box, and then you can take them out, clean the cage, and then just kind of put them back in with a clean box. You can also lock them in there and use it to carry them down the hall to the lab. That's why we have the handles on top here. And we even had some latches, although we didn't usually have to latch them. They kind of like being in the box, and they're usually pretty quiet. So they were convenient for us, and the woodchucks liked them. Again, all stainless steel. And when we were reading up before we got the woodchucks, we weren't sure whether they were a social species or not. The reading that we did suggested that adult woodchucks are pretty solitary. They don't like to be together, especially males with males, and that it was not advisable to house them in a small cage together, just in a large area. They might get along. But we found out that our woodchucks had different ideas, at least the girls, and some of our females preferred to be with another female, and these two actually took the divider out between their two adjacent cages and decided that they wanted to cuddle up in the same tunnel. I was amazed. I did not think that two woodchucks would fit in that mailbox, but obviously they did. So if you have woodchucks in the future, it would be a good idea to try out pairing some of the females. I don't think I'd try the males even off season, but feel free to try if you want to. There were quite a few challenges. I mentioned that the gnawing behavior, so everything had to be stainless steel or replaced all the time. One woodchuck was very industrious and decided to break the welds on the caging and bend the wires down, which you can see over on the left. And they could also escape through any hole they could get their head through, so they would knock the feeders out and then squeeze out through the feeder hole. They could actually flex these wire doors enough so that the latch would be in the middle, and they would push the top or the bottom enough to flex it and be able to squeeze out that way. So they were very strong, they're very persistent, and they have a very high desire to get out of the cages. You can see on the right-hand picture here, this girl is sitting up on top. They're very good climbers. And I don't know whether you've got that video working, but this would be the time to show it if it's working. Okay, it doesn't look like our video is working, so unfortunately, it's how this girl got out. She actually went over to the latch, she chewed on it, she pushed it with her paw until it slid over, and then flipped it over, and then jumped on the door until it opened. So she just opened the door and climbed out. What's interesting in her case, the door actually is what holds the floor pan in place. The floor pan is the roof of the cage below. So when she got out and left the door open, the woodchuck in the cage underneath figured out that he could push that floor forward, his ceiling forward, and he did that, and he climbed up the back inside to her cage, and then he could get out too. Fortunately for us, these animals don't breed year-round, or we might have had some unexpected babies. They are also a real challenge to catch. They do not like to be caught, so they will run around the room. They're very good at avoiding you. They like to go under things. They climb on top of things. They can actually jump from the top of one cage rack to the other. And in some cage racks, we actually did have a separate floor and ceiling and between the cages, one on top of the other, and they would squeeze into that small area between the floor and the ceiling. They avoided nets. They didn't want to go into their mailboxes, and they were basically really hard to catch them. And they seemed quite proud of themselves when they got out. So as far as taking care of these guys, in the wild they eat grasses and fruits and vegetables. So we feed them a rabbit diet, which is, they can eat a plain rabbit diet, or there's a woodchuck diet that is basically a rabbit diet, but the pellets are a little bigger. So that's what we usually feed them as their basic diet, but we supplemented with a lot of fruits and vegetables. They really, really like these little carrots, and that's what we used as a reward when they were good. When we had to take them out for a blood draw or something, they got little carrots when they came back. But there were other things that they liked as well. The woodchucks can drink from a crock, a water bottle, or automatic watering. The ones that we got in were not trained for automatic watering, so we would start them with a crock, but we kept a video camera on them and watched them, and they eventually did figure out how to use the automatic watering. So you just have to give them time to get used to it. We didn't try water bottles. If you do use water bottles, they will knock them on the floor. So we just didn't go that route. But they're pretty smart. Despite the name Woodchuck Hard Cider, this is not an appropriate beverage for woodchucks. I just wanted to point that out in case you see this. Not an appropriate beverage. I mentioned that they're hibernating species, and light cycle is very important to them for determining the time of year. They even if they don't go into hibernation, they will have a metabolic cycle. So if you keep them in a normal animal room, they will still cycle. Their weights will go up and down. Their appetites will go up and down with the season. Because this is a natural cycle that's built into them, it's approximately a year long, but some are a little longer, some are a little less. So if you keep them on a light cycle that's the same all the time, they'll start to drift. So over a year or two, you'll start to see some that are a slightly shorter light cycle. They'll be getting their cycle a little bit earlier, and the other ones will be a little later, and they get out of sync. Because we didn't want our colony to get out of sync, we used a seasonal light cycle adjustments, so they would at least all be going into their quiet period, their metabolic period at the same time. You can't get rid of it altogether, but at least you can keep them the same so that your animals are in the same part of their cycle. So we just adjusted the lights based on the time outside that the sun was up. If you really want them to go into full hibernation, you need the light cycle. You also need to lower the room temperature considerably and restrict their food. With those cues, they will go into a full hibernation. We didn't want them to do that, so we just kept them on that cycle to keep them in sync. They do lose a lot of weight. Their activity decreases. They eat less. There's less feces. They can lose up to 50% of their body weight between the summer and the hibernation period. As with other species, we like to provide environmental enrichment. We like to have them perform species-typical behaviors, which in their case is mostly sitting in their little hutches. You can't really provide them a substrate to tunnel, but they dig around in the shavings. And like I said, some of them will actually use them to build a nest inside their hutches. They are very food motivated, especially in the spring and summer when they would normally be eating their heads off. They enjoyed fruits such as cantaloupe. That was a big favorite. And over here on the left, you can see Susie just gobbling down that cantaloupe. She just loved it. The carrots, as I mentioned, the little guy in the middle. And they also liked cereals and crackers and things like that. We actually were feeding some cereal. We had some Lucky Charms. If you're familiar with that, it's a cereal, but it's got little pieces of marshmallow in it. And Susie decided she liked the marshmallow better than the cereal, and she would pick all the marshmallows out and wait until they were all gone before she would actually eat the cereal. And if you just gave her cereal, she would turn up her nose. So they have different personalities. Another thing that you can use for enrichment is hay. You can give them fresh grass from outside. So there are other things that you can add in, and different woodchucks like different things. So it kind of depends on their personality as well as what's going on outside in the season. Restraining woodchucks is another challenge. They are difficult to handle. They're very defensive. Even the lab-reared ones still have some degree of wild animal in them. Occasionally, they're actually aggressive and they'll jump towards you, but usually it's more defensive behavior. They have very long, sharp teeth. They have long claws and very strong legs and can cause some pretty nasty injuries. So you don't want to have that happen. They're hard to grab a hold of. They have a thick, heavy body with really muscular shoulders, but the skin is very mobile. It's got a lot of subcutaneous fat, and it just kind of slides around, so it's very hard to get a good hold on them if you're just grabbing the skin. Their legs are very short, and their tail's not real long either. But you can grab the tail. You can pick them up briefly by the tail. You don't want to do that for a long period of time because they will flip around and climb up their own tails to get your hand. But it's good to kind of swing them up onto another surface or into a box or something like that. The other reason not to hold them by the tail very long is that the contents of their gastrointestinal tract are very heavy, and you don't want to have that sitting on their diaphragm and potentially pressing on their ability to breathe. But we would, in this case, where we had wake animals, we had a restrainer built. This was a tube that was, again, kind of like a tunnel. We would lift the animals up onto the table quickly by the tail, use a gloved hand to guide them into the restrainer. It was only made to cover the front part of the animal, so that was the big, strong front claws and the teeth. So that would keep the handlers safer. It would keep the animal fairly quiet because they were in a tunnel, and that's how we handled them when they were awake. This was a device that we had custom made. As you can see, it's strapped to the table because they do wiggle and they can easily kick that whole thing right off the table. But for most procedures, such as a physical exam, something like that, if you're trying to get blood from a vein, you really need to anesthetize them. So we primarily used isoflurane gas anesthesia in a chamber, as you can see on the left, and they would, go down in the chamber, and then you could maintain them on a face mask. You can use injectable anesthetics also. We did sometimes use Tilazol, but we did like the gas anesthesia because they will wake up very quickly. If you ever need to sex a woodchuck, it's actually not too hard. They are, like many other species, have a pretty decent difference in their anal genital distance. This is a male on the left, and you can see it's about this far between the genital and the anus, and the female, it's just a short period. This guy, you can see his testicles under the skin. This is, he's in breeding season, which is only a few months in the spring. Most of the rest of the year, you would not really see those testicles there. They would retract into the body. They're very small. So they only are prominent during the breeding season. So I mentioned vascular access. Under anesthesia, there are a number of different vessels that you can access. The cephalic vein in the front leg, it's very small, it's a very short leg, but you can access that. We like to put a little catheter in there rather than just trying to tap it directly with the needle. But you could do either depending on the volume of blood you needed. They also on the hind legs, inside the hind leg, you can access the femoral vessel, the femoral vein. And you can also, if you feel confident doing a free stick, a kind of a blind stick in the jugular area, you can try to get blood from the jugular vein in the neck. They don't have a true jugular vein. It's actually the anastomosis of the lingual, facial, and maxillary veins, but it's a lot easier to say jugular, so that's what we call it, even though technically it's not a jugular vein. You can kind of see that in the picture on the right here. The arrow kind of points to what you would think would be a jugular vein. It's an anastomosis of two vessels. But I really put this up because we had studies where we needed to do multiple IV dosing. We needed multiple blood samples. And rather than have to keep anesthetizing the animals and hitting veins, we did implant vascular access ports into most of our animals. I'll be talking about that more tomorrow, but we found that this was not too hard to do, and once they went in, it was much, much easier to access the animals. They did not have to be anesthetized. We would put them in that restrainer, and this is why it was only a half a restrainer. We wanted the hind end out, and I can show you, you can probably see, but I'll just point it out. This is where the port is under the skin. And then you just access it percutaneously with a needle and a line, and then you can draw the blood up. Or you can dose if you need to dose, either way. We did put both arterial and venous ports in. Some animals had both. Some had just the arterial port, which is more for collecting blood rather than dosing. And we had pretty good success with them. I mean, they stayed, many of them were patent for quite a while until the animals were euthanized. So we found that quite convenient, and it was worth the effort of surgically putting the ports in. Oral dosing is a cinch. Very easy to orally dose a woodchuck. They have a large gap between their front incisors and their back chewing teeth called the diastema. And all you have to do is put a metal feeding needle, kind of a long one, 4 to 6 inches long, on a syringe and put the tip of that needle right behind their incisors and just put in whatever liquid you need to put in. And they're pretty adaptable to that. You can see you don't have to restrain them at all. They're just sitting in their little hutch, and you put it in. There is something called liquid Woodchuck Diet, which is something kind of a thick liquid, kind of like pancake batter, kind of smells like pancake batter. I've heard it tastes like pancake batter, but I never actually tried it myself. But the woodchucks will really love this. And you can see the woodchuck on the right is actually trying to pull the syringe away from the researcher because he wants to get all of it. So they really like this Woodchuck diet, so you can use it as a carrier for any other liquid medication if you need to, or you can put powders and mix it in because it's a pretty thick liquid. So that's another good way to give them oral doses. You can do injections, IM injections, sub-Q injections, but then of course you have to handle the animal. So we tried to do oral as much as possible. Medical issues. Some of our animals were wild-caught, some were lab-reared. So we had different issues depending on their background. Wild-caught animals could have parasites. Specifically, we would see coccidia. They could have tapeworms. If we got them from a vendor, they would usually have already treated them for tapeworms. So we didn't often see that, but we did see coccidia. They needed several treatments sometimes to get rid of those. So that's one thing that we would definitely treat right off the bat. They could come in with various kinds of wounds or scars. If it was an active wound, an open wound, you can give them antibiotics. Again, the oral antibiotics in some type of a liquid suspension is the easiest way to do it. For some of these larger open wounds that are not real deep, but they're just kind of like an abrasion or a flat wound, we would just put Wonder Dust on it. This is an antibiotic powder, and it just kind of helps dry the wound out, and it also acts, as an antibiotic, which it is. And we found that pretty successful. Sometimes they would come in with a pododermatitis. So the bottoms of their feet would have ulcers on them. Those are very hard to treat. We obviously would give them antibiotics and tried bandaging the feet just to kind of give them some extra protection from the stainless steel flooring. We like to use colloid bandages, which you can pick up at the drugstore. That helps to keep the area moist so that they can heal, but not too moist. You don't want them, soaking wet. And you can do the bandage changes. Usually it's the back feet, so you can do the bandage changes in that restrainer with their front end protected and their back feet out where you can reach them. Unfortunately, they do not tend to heal well. The one that we had was pretty bad when it came in when we first got it. This was a wild-caught animal, and we never were able to get it to heal. Basically, this animal lived in bandages the whole time we had it. Now, once they're in the lab, they can also get this pododermatitis. We did have one that developed while we had it, but he cleared up pretty well. So I think if you catch it early enough, it's a lot easier to treat. We put more bedding in his cage so that he had a little more padding from the floor and antibiotics, and he seemed to come along quite well. They can also get some wounds, even though we didn't allow them to get together and fight. Sometimes they would get themselves, they could get out for one thing, and they could hurt themselves that way, but they would push their faces through the door or then kind of scratch up their noses sometimes. And we had a number of them develop something at the base of the tail. We're not really sure what it was, but because it was multiple animals in a similar location, we think it might have been something maybe physiologic in there. It reminded me of cats that have something called stud tail. It's an accumulation of body secretions from the skin, and it gets kind of irritated. The hair gets lost. And that's kind of what these look like. They would lose their hair. It would just be a kind of large, slightly ulcerated or reddened area. And we would treat those mostly topically, that was a good way to use the Wonder Dust. And again, I think it might have been something physiologic, hormonal, or something like that, but we never really could figure out what was causing it. Didn't seem to be from injury because it was at a place on the body that doesn't really contact much of anything. In the research-related medical issues, there were several, especially in the hepatitis-positive animals, because they could have liver disease. In addition, some of the animals were getting quite a few blood draws. So between a liver disease and a lot of blood draws, we had some cases of anemia. Based on the results of the blood test, the CBC, we could, it looked like it was an iron deficiency anemia in these particular cases. So we think it was a combination anemia from liver disease, anemia from blood draws, and probably not enough iron in their diet. We don't really know exactly how much iron they need in their diet, but with all the blood draws, it seemed that they were losing too much iron. We would give them some iron dextran, and they would come right around. So that worked really well. They can have also clotting disorders because their livers are not creating enough clotting factors, and those, we didn't see any clinical problems with it, but if we were doing surgery, we would give them some vitamin K before surgery just to kind of give them that little edge in case they had a tendency to have a bleeding problem. So that was just something we did prophylactically, but we never saw any clinical signs. If you let the liver go on to a more serious state, they can have other problems, low blood glucose, seizures. Those can be problems as the livers get more and more diseased. We did not actually need the animals to get to that point. So as soon as we thought they were starting to get tumors, we would usually euthanize them at that point so they didn't have to suffer. The way we figured out whether they were having problems was by tracking their blood work, looking at liver enzymes, and in particular the GGT enzyme, which I don't remember what it stands for, but it's GGT. That enzyme is very predictive of when they get liver cancer. So it would be, baseline, and then it would start to creep up. And when we saw it creeping up, we would watch them very carefully. And it could go from, our limit of detection was about 2. It could go up to 50, 70, 100, or even higher. And at that point, we were pretty confident that they had a liver tumor, even if they weren't showing any signs. So at that point, we would usually euthanize them because we didn't need them to be at that state. So those are kind of research-related or WHV-related diseases. So that is pretty much all I had to say about basic care of the species. I mean, there's tons more, but I think I'll open it up to questions so that we can see what specifically you're interested in knowing. So anyone has any questions, feel free to join in now.
Well, thank you so very much, Doctor, for your presentation. Before we get started on the question and answer session, I would like to remind our audience how to submit questions. You can submit questions by typing them in the Q&A box, which can be found by clicking on the green Q&A button at the lower left of the presentation window. And we're going to try to answer as many questions as we can. Our first question for you is, can you describe how you pair them for mating? Do they injure each other during mating?
Well, we actually did not mate animals. We were not trying to breed them. They have, we've talked with other labs that do mating, and they don't really have a problem with that. They're generally pretty affiliative. The males will seek out the females, and the females will seek out the males. So I have not heard of them having any kind of injury from mating. They do only mate once a year, So they're only interested in each other in the spring, February, March, if they're outdoors.
And our next question is, where do you get the woodchucks?
Well, that's a good question. When we first learned that we needed woodchucks, they were required by the FDA for this particular study because it's kind of the model for HPV studies. We looked into a number of options, including trapping them, buying them from a vendor, trying to get them from animal patrol places that trapped animals for a living, and then maybe they would give them to us. One thing we found out is that not all woodchuck populations have Woodchuck hepatitis virus. So in our area, which is Connecticut, most of the woodchucks do not have this virus. If you want to trap animals in the wild, you want to go to parts of Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Maryland, a little farther down on the Atlantic seacoast, and that's where it's endemic in the population. So we didn't really think we were going to do that. There is a vendor. He actually works out of Idaho, but he comes east and he traps woodchucks and takes them back, and he'll do the conditioning. He will deworm them. He will take blood samples. You often need to know whether an animal is chronically infected or not, so you want to take multiple blood samples over a period of time to be sure that they're not just going through an acute phase of the disease. So he will do all of that, and then he'll sell them to you for a large sum of money. So that's an option. There are not very many woodchuck vendors out there that will do that, so he's pretty much our only option. There was a vendor in Canada, but we felt that it would be impractical for us to try to import the woodchucks across country lines, and it was easier to just stay within the United States. In one case, we were desperate for woodchucks right away, so he actually came directly from his trapping run and gave us some woodchucks that were wild caught, that he had just caught and had not conditioned them at all. So we did have some wild caught woodchucks. We had some trapped woodchucks, and we also had some woodchucks that had been trapped as pregnant females, which he had taken back to his lab, and then he would raise the pups in the lab. You could actually, infect the pups, manually inject them with the Woodchuck hepatitis virus to increase the chances that they will develop that chronic disease. So you can raise them that way and increase the percentage of them that will be positive. So we kind of had all three.
Well, fantastic. Before we let you go today, Doctor, is there any closing remarks that you have?
Well, I hope this was interesting. I hope it was useful to people who might be getting woodchucks in the future, who have woodchucks now. And I hope it was at least interesting to those who were just curious about this species. And I appreciate you all coming to hear it. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Doctor, again for your time and your outstanding presentation. I'd also like to thank Labroots for making today's educational webcast possible. Today's webcast will be available for on-demand viewing through May 2017. You'll receive an email from Labroots alerting you when this webcast will be available for replay. We invite you to forward that announcement to your colleagues who may have missed today's live event. And until next time, goodbye.